Hey everyone, it's Heather Nichols, and today I'm creating with the brand new Wheatfield Dreams kit from Tailored Expressions. I'll be using the new Wheatfield Dreams stamp set and coordinating dies from the kit. Another item from the kit that I'll be using is the burlap background stamp. I'll be using the third largest die in the Stitched Rectangle Stacklets die collection. For ink colors, I'll be using chocolate truffle and toffee. I'm doing embossing on this project, and so I have my Versamark ink, my powder tool, and from the kit is the copper embossing powder. I'm coloring the images on my project with liquid watercolor. I have pineapple, honey, chocolate truffle, and sweet basil, and I'll use a paintbrush to apply the color. And finally, I'm using foam squares to pop up some of the elements on my projects. I'll be stamping the images from the Wheatfield Dreams stamp set with my MISTI. I'll start here with the sunflower, and I'll also be stamping the wheat. I'm using the 118-pound watercolor cardstock. Now, this has two distinct sides. One is more textured and one is more smooth, and I'll be stamping on the smooth side. So I'll set this up in my MISTI, and I will set the stamp. I'm doing it kind of in the upper left-hand corner, so I can flip the cardstock to stamp this twice. I'll close the lid of the MISTI to pick up the stamp. I'm treating the cardstock with my anti-static powder tool so that the embossing powder only sticks to the Versamark ink and not to other parts of my paper. I'll ink up the stamp with Versamark ink and stamp that onto the watercolor cardstock by closing the lid of the MISTI and use my Just Press tool to apply even pressure. Once I've stamped my sunflower, I'll rotate my paper 180 degrees and stamp the image again. Next, I took a piece of scrap paper and I have that underneath, and I'll sprinkle the copper embossing powder over the top of the stamped images. Once the images are covered, I'll tap off the extra powder, funnel the other powder back into the original container, and then I'll use my heat tool to melt the embossing powder until it is shiny. I'll repeat these steps to stamp the wheat images onto the watercolor cardstock. I'm stamping two of these images as well and embossing it with the copper embossing powder. Now that the images are embossed, I'm going to cut them out with the coordinating dies using my Sidekick machine. I'm taking a pair of scissors and just trimming in between them so they'll fit right through the die cut machine. I'll line the die right up on top of the image, use some Scotch removable tape to hold the die in place, and send them through my Sidekick machine. Now it's time to add color with liquid watercolor paints. I'm starting off with pineapple, and we're going to do the sunflower first, and I'm adding a few drops of the pineapple liquid watercolor to my palette. Then I'm going to use a wet brush and add that pineapple color to the petals of the sunflower. You'll notice that I'm painting plain water onto the petals before I add the color, and that will help your paint flow into the area that you want the color to go. Next, I'm using honey watercolor to add shading to those petals. While the paint is still wet, if I just touch my brush that has got honey watercolor onto it, onto the base of those petals, you'll notice a shadow going from the base and spreading out, which is exactly what I want. I also added honey watercolor to the center of the flower, and I'll be using chocolate truffle watercolor to add shading there. Now you'll notice I got a big blop at first, and when that happens, just have a paper towel nearby that you can scrunch up and just dab, and it will lift that color out of there. So it's very easy to erase while your watercolor is still wet. I used sweet basil liquid watercolor to paint the stem on the sunflower, and you'll notice while I was painting the stem, the chocolate truffle watercolor bled out into the sunflower petals. I used some paper towel to dab that and fix that, and then went back and added a little extra shading with the honey liquid watercolor. For the wheat images, I started with a layer of the pineapple watercolor over the whole image. While the paint was still wet, I went back with the honey liquid watercolor and added dabs of the color at the base of the wheat kernels at the top of the stalks. And I also added a little bit of shadow to the leaves at the bottom. And then to finish, I added just a touch of the chocolate truffle liquid watercolor to the wheat stalks. After I had everything painted and let everything dry, I love adding splatters to my watercolored images. I splattered the sunflowers and wheat with chocolate truffle liquid watercolor and also the opaque white Copic ink. I'm stamping a background for my cards using the burlap background stamp, and I'll be stamping this on toffee cardstock using toffee ink. I'm setting the stamp into my MISTI, closing the lid to pick that up, and then I'll add toffee cardstock into the guide on my MISTI grid mat, and I have some adhesive in there to hold that in place. I'll ink up the stamp with toffee ink and then close the lid of the MISTI using my Just Press tool to apply even pressure to stamp the image onto the cardstock. Off camera, I die cut 2 pieces from Sugar Cube cardstock using the 3rd largest die in the Stitched Rectangle Stackless die collection. You can see I added a few splatters onto them as well. I'm going to arrange my watercolored images onto these pieces of cardstock that I cut out, and then I'm going to stamp a sentiment at the top right-hand corner of the piece. So I'm just laying everything out, and I decided on the thank you sentiment from the stamp set. I stamped that into the top corner using chocolate truffle ink. I used my Scotch tape runner to adhere the wheat stalk images directly to the die cut panels. For the sunflowers, I popped them up a bit with foam squares. I used the full foam squares for the top of the flower, and for the stem, I used my scissors and trimmed the foam squares to fit behind it. If you ever need to cut down your foam squares, a tip is to leave it on the backing paper. That way, the foam squares aren't going to stick all over your scissors when you cut them. I used my scissors again to trim the stems that were extending down beyond the bottom of the die cut panel. Alright, let's finish putting these cards together. I'm attaching the backgrounds to a Sugar Cube card base with my Scotch tape runner, and then I'll use foam squares again to attach the panels with the wheat and sunflowers on them to the card fronts. These cards are done, and I really love how they turned out. The images from the Wheatfield Dreams stamp set are just beautiful, and I love the copper embossing powder included in the kit. You can find the supplies that I used to create these projects at tailoredexpressions.com. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody, and I'll see you next time.